Hello, good evening. This is a video for module TMM2051, and that's New Testament Studies, and we're in this half term looking at St. Paul, and this is week 8, and we're looking at the assignment topic, issues in Paul, men and women. So let me just put you onto the handout, which I'll be distributing via email. One of the things which is really important for us to think about whenever we're reading an ancient text, but particularly reading an ancient text that for the community that holds it has a great deal of authority, is the question of framing. How do we frame biblical texts? Well, why would it matter? Well, because to a certain extent, a text without a context is a pretext for a proof text. And proof texts can work in both ways. People can use proof texts to justify whatever they want. People can also use proof texts to, perpetrate acts of sabotage on other people's theological structures. And so actually one of the disciplines, I think, of reading an ancient text is learning to exercise a bit of restraint. And what teaches us restraint is this question of framing. What do we place around the text so as to try to establish context? And that isn't to say that texts don't have a long and vibrant, sometimes mixed life, long after their author and the historical context of the author has passed and gone the way of all flesh. They really do. But it's important for us to recognise at some level that that Christianity is a religion that has a particular sort of relationship to history, and so some of the framing that we do has been thus far historical, geographical and cultural, but this week we're going to be thinking historically, not so much about geography and culture as about concepts, the concept man and woman themselves. And of course those concepts straddle all of the categories that we've looked at so far. One of the first things to recognise about ancient writers is that they just think differently from us. Not totally differently, but sufficiently differently for them to appear quite alien. There's that old saying, and I forget who it was that wrote it, the past is a foreign country, for they do things differently there. And they don't just do things differently there, they think differently. The concepts themselves that they hold are different from ours. And so, of course, they might inhabit a world which is populated by men and women, but they think of men and women differently than the way we think of men and women. And it's also worth bearing in mind that ancient writers were by no means unanimous in their views about men and women. And there's a very real question regarding, where to locate Paul in relation to that background, and also to what extent Paul's work marks a departure from this background. And this is in effect to ask whether Christ inaugurated a revolution in the way we saw ourselves. Certainly the writer Tom Holland, in his book Dominion, is firmly of the opinion that there was a kind of bomb went off in the Christ event, and particularly in Paul's understanding of the Christ event, that has in effect built Europe. And there's a degree of truth in that. And it's, even if we anticipate, as I think we could fairly do, that Paul has significant points of departure from some of his contemporaries and some of his antecedents, it remains clear to some degree or other that the context for understanding Paul's writings and what they might have meant to Paul's first hearers, that context is established when we try to reconstruct some of the views of the broader culture. And so I'm going to take you through 3 short texts. And I'm taking you through these, and I could have chosen half a dozen others, dozens of others actually, but I've just chosen them because they illustrate several points and also they straddle Paul. The first writer, Aristotle, was several centuries before Paul. The second writer, Philo of Alexandria, was roughly contemporaneous. And the third writer, Clement of Alexandria, was a couple of centuries after. And so this is just to give you a kind of smorgasbord of ancient views on sex and gender. So I'm going to take you through Aristotle. Aristotle on politics. And this is a debate in politics about whether slaves and women and children can possess moral virtue. Because, of course, in the ancient world, people lived in households, and as we've found out that the households were mostly patriarchal, and the patriarch, the pater familias of the household, had responsibility for all of the slaves, all of the women and all of the children that lived in that household. And the question Aristotle's posing is there something about slaves and something about women and something about children that makes them differ from the master of the house? If they don't, well, this would be a curious thing, because it would mean that it would mean at some degree that their status within the household was kind of arbitrarily enforced. And of course that would be the modern take, that because as moderns for the most part we're committed to the equality of people as people, we tend to think patriarchal modes of organisation are irrational and arbitrary. Aristotle's aware of that argument, but he's approaching it from the other end of the tunnel. He's not committed to people being equal as people. And so what he says is he raises the question, do women and children and slaves have virtues? Because, of course, for Aristotle, virtues were key. Straight away we find an indication in connection with the soul, he says. For the soul, and this is key, by nature contains a part that rules and a part that is ruled, to which we assign different virtues. That is the virtue of the rational and the virtue of the irrational. And then by analogy, he applies this also to human organisation, that there's a same principle at play in other instances of ruler and ruled. Hence there are by nature various classes. The free rules the slave, the male rules the female, and the man the child. But, he argues, in a different way. And this is where it gets interesting. Because, the man, the slave, the woman, and the child all possess the various parts of the soul, he says. But they possess them in different ways. And the slave hasn't got the rational, the deliberative part at all, the part that allows us to orient ourselves towards the good and to pursue it. The female has that, but it lacks authority. What does that mean? Well, it means that the woman's passions can overwhelm her reason. Whereas the child has it, but the child's reason is undeveloped. And so the ruler must possess intellectual virtue, a reason, in completeness, while each of the other parties must have whatever share of that virtue is appropriate to them. And do you see what Aristotle's done there is he's assumed at some level that for the Greek household organisation to be good, and he does believe that it is good, it must be rooted ultimately in nature rather than in something arbitrary. And what that means, he thinks, is that human nature is hierarchically ordered. Slaves are fully human, but they're incomplete in some regards. Women are fully human, but they're incomplete in some regards. Children are incomplete in a different way. And so here's this little point of explanation. So the lordship of a free Greek householder over his slaves, wife and offspring is for Aristotle rooted in certain natural differences. Slaves are mostly barbarian and so aren't fully rational, and they can't see or pursue the good without an external locus of control to point them in the direction of the good and to motivate them to pursue it. Free Greek women are fully rational, but their deliberative faculty, their reason, is incapable of attaining mastery over the passions, and so they need an external lord to help them. They see the good, they can pursue it, but they are incomplete, and for Aristotle this incompletion is permanently so. So they need external direction, but in a different way from slaves. Free Greek male children are like slaves, but their incompleteness is a temporary state. When you see there that what we're dealing with is you might call it the naturalization of certain cultural norms, by appealing to a notion of human nature, but a differentiated human nature. This is very common in Antiquity. Philo of Alexandria, let's move on. So here we've got Philo, who's roughly contemporaneous with Paul, talking about men and women. And this is from one of Philo's books called The Special Laws. So marketplaces and council chambers and courts of justice and large companies and assemblies of crowds and a life in the open air full of arguments and actions relating to war and peace are suited to men, but taking care of the house and remaining at home are the proper duties of women, the virgins having their apartments in the centre of the house within the innermost doors, and the full-grown woman not going beyond the vestibule and the outer courts. For there are two kinds of states, the greater and the smaller. The larger ones are called cities, but the smaller ones houses. And the superintendence and management of these is allotted to the two sexes separately, the men having the government of the greater, which government is called a polity, and the woman that of the smaller, which is called the economy. Therefore let no woman busy herself about those things which are beyond the province of economy, but let her cultivate solitude, and not be seen to be going about like a woman who walks in the streets in the sights of other men, except when it's necessary for her to go to temple, if she has any proper regard for herself. And even then let her not go at noon when the market is full, but after the greater part of the people have returned home, like a well-born woman, a real and true citizen, performing her vows and her sacrifices in tranquillity, so as to avert evils and to receive blessings. To us this seems terribly restrictive, absurd in many respects, but to Philo, his basic point is that the social categories of ancient Mediterranean culture map onto separate spheres of space and function. And actually what's really interesting, historically speaking, is actually how novel our more liberated sense really is. Because, it's only 100 years ago that educated middle-class women were saying it is for reasons of family and domestic economy that we want the vote, because the government is now involving itself in matters that pertain to family and domestic economy. And so actually one of the things which is really interesting is how recently this sort of separation of spheres model died out. But in terms of the ancient Mediterranean model, we need to imagine Philo as an educated Jew pursuing a pattern of behaviours that aren't radically different from Gentile norms about men and women. The idea that male space is public space and female space is domestic space is something that is deep-rooted in the ancient Mediterranean. And part of the reason is to do with visibility. Did you notice in the text that, it's not right for the woman to be going around about where she could be seen by other men? There's this anxiety about the male gaze. I should imagine that when she was on her way to temple, she veiled. Does that have any bearing on what Paul's arguing for in 1 Corinthians? It's worth thinking this through. Notice also that the differential treatment between wives and virgins, not to mention the instructions about passing through the market when it's less crowded. Honour isn't mentioned, but it's lingering in the background of this passage. And so I want to flag this up to you as an example of how ancient writers navigated space, because space is important. And space governs all sorts of things, like when it's proper to speak, under what conditions it might be proper to speak. This might be a key passage for understanding something like 1 Corinthians 11 and 1 Corinthians 14. Our last passage, and I think you'll find this very curious, but hear me out. It's from a book called Pedagogos by Clement of Alexandria, and it's some centuries after Paul, but the ideas predate Paul. So, God wished women to be smooth and to rejoice in their locks, which grow spontaneously like a horse in his mane, but God has adorned man like the lions with a beard, and has endowed him as an attribute of manhood with a hairy chest, shaggy breasts, a sign this of strength and of rule. Like cockerels which fight in defence of the hens, he's decked them with combs, like helmets. God sets such a high value on these locks that he orders them to make their appearance on men simultaneously with discretion, and delighted with a venerable look, has honoured gravity of countenance with grey hair. But wisdom and discriminating judgments that are hoary with wisdom attain maturity with time, and by the vigour of long experience give strength to old age, producing grey hairs, the admirable flower of venerable wisdom. This then is the mark of the man, the beard, by which he is seen to be a man. He is seen to be older than Eve, and is the token of the superior nature. In this, God deemed it right that man should excel, and he dispersed hair over man's whole body. Whatever smoothness and softness was in the man, he abstracted from his side when he formed the woman Eve, physically receptive, his partner in parentage, his help in domestic management, while he, Adam, had parted with all smoothness, remained a man, and shows himself man. And to him has been assigned action as to her suffering, for what is shaggy is drier and warmer than what is smooth. Wherefore males have both more hair and more heat than females, animals that are entire, more than those which are emasculated, animals which are perfect, complete, more than those which are imperfect or incomplete. So what does all this mean? Well, the point here is that for Clement, the social categories of ancient Mediterranean culture map onto distinct norms of attire and conventions of appearance. Males ought to be hairy, females ought to be smooth. These are natural symbols. This isn't an unknown argument. There was a Greek writer called Epictetus, who was a Stoic, who made basically this argument. But the symbolism is rooted for Clement as for many ancients in ideas about biology. Males are hotter and drier than cooler, wet females. They really believed this. They thought that men were dry and women were wet, men were hot and women were cold. And there was even a philosophical writer called Varro who assigned Greco-Roman divinities to the different elements based upon this taxonomy of hot and dry and wet and cold, so that all of the male deities were hot and dry and all of the female deities corresponded to the cooler and wetter elements like earth and water. Now, these beliefs about males and females go back to Aristotle in his book on the generation of animals, and they go back even before then. And they were a common way of describing physical reproductive differences. How so? Well, Aristotle believed that women had periods because their bodies lacked the heat to convert blood into sperm, which is one of the reasons why they have to slough off the excess unsuccessfully transformed blood once a month. To be female in that sense was to be an incomplete male. Now, it's this idea to which Clement, who is a Christian writer, refers when he describes women as emasculated males in the final sentence of the excerpt that we've looked at. And when it says perfect, we need to read that not as morally perfect, but kind of complete. Intact would be an interesting word to use. An intact or a not intact male. And so actually what you've got to see there is that, as the writer Thomas Laqueur described, it might be better to think about ancient notions of gender as not two things within the one species, but as a single spectrum within the one species. So it's not that there's a category of male and a category of female, it's that there's a single spectrum with male at the top and various stages of incompletion with women at the other end. Now, why am I mentioning all of this? Well, we have to be attuned to hearing the assumptions that informed these ideas in biblical writers. We need to listen for them so that we can work out whether the biblical writer is aligned with his background or her background or distinct from it. We can't know whether a biblical writer has produced something which is revolutionary until we see whether it's similar or different, or in what ways it's similar and in what ways it's different from its background. This is one thing that this is one point in which Lucy Peppiatt and I, and you, hopefully you'll have had a chance to see the video of Lucy and I in conversation. This is one of the things that Lucy Peppiatt and I have talked around at various points, because I think Paul is doing something which is revolutionary, but I think Paul's revolutionary instincts occur even though, in terms of his assumptions about sex and gender, he's not terribly different from his background. So in other words, I don't think that... I think Paul believes that in Christ something revolutionary occurs, but I don't think he believes what we believe about men and women. Lucy would probably argue that that something more revolutionary has occurred. I think that how to put it. I think that I'd agree, but I think one of the most interesting ideas that you could bring to the Pauline epistles is the idea that the true scale of the revolution in Christ is only visible against the backdrop of the culture out of which it came. That's not to say that the culture which the Christian Revelation built must replicate those ideas, but actually I find it helpful to read these ideas and then see precisely why Christianity was so profoundly attractive to women. That's a long way round towards saying please do read and engage with these texts. Keep coming back to them, and hopefully we'll have a chance to discuss them tomorrow. I'm going to share this handout. Again, sorry that the video that the videos have been a bit tricky this week. We've had tech problems, but I haven't quite worked out what it is. In any case, I hope this gives you enough food for thought that you can then begin to locate yourself in this particular field. Thank you for that. Well, I hope to see you soon. God bless.